Well, good morning, one and all. And thank you very much for coming to our little church on this glorious, glorious day. You see that Cindy has closed the doors in the back so nobody else can come. I call your attention, first of all, thank you to our sister church, Sharon, who is, a lot of representatives are here in the audience. As you know, it's a little bit special today. We have a guest speaker, whom I know fairly well, and that has brought out all of these people, apparently. We'd like to do it every Sunday. It's just the airfare from Houston is just too much to bear. I call your attention to the announcements. I make a habit of never reading them. I feel that people are able to read. And there is an extra set of announcements, and that's for all the Sharon people, because they've got things going on as well as we do. But today, things are going on here. So thank you one and all for being here and sharing it with us.
Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm very grateful to have been afforded the opportunity to speak to you all today. For anyone out there who doesn't know who I am, my name is Matthew Vreeland. I'm the son of Richard and Susan Vreeland, who you probably know if you've been coming here for any length of time. And I grew up attending this church. I was baptized here, and I attended Sunday school here. And throughout the entirety of my childhood, I was here nearly every Sunday with my family, as my sister will attest, sitting in the same pew where they're sitting today. Since then, I moved to Virginia for a time, where I attained a degree in philosophy at Roanoke College. I also met my good friend Shayna, who is kind enough to come up to visit me here today. To my dismay, I found that I was ultimately unable to parlay my degree into a career as a neighborhood philosopher, but I nevertheless consider the experience I gained during this period of my life to have been eminently formative in the development of who I am today. Until quite recently, I considered my church upbringing to be almost entirely distinct from this philosophical education, and to be frank, I had stopped paying much attention to the former. I have since discovered that many of the ethical concepts to which I was exposed through philosophy could inform my interpretation of Christianity. And this has reconciled the religious tradition in which I was brought up with the understanding that I gained in school. It is chiefly this discovery that encouraged me to fly home from Texas, where I currently reside, and I brought a few Texans with me. We can talk to them afterward. They really do talk funny. It's great. To speak to you today about how philosophy can inform our understanding of a topic that is central to Christian ethics, forgiveness. So I'm going to start with a philosophical example. Of particular interest for this discussion is the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch philosopher of the 17th century who is considered by many to be one of the great rationalists of the Western philosophical tradition. I was first exposed to Spinoza's work as a sophomore in college, and it was on this occasion that I knew with certainty that I had no choice but to become a philosophy major. As laid out in his magnum opus, which is simply titled Ethics, Spinoza's basic premise is that all things are derived from a singular fundamental substance, and substance in this case meaning that which stands beneath, rather than this sort of scientific definition we're more familiar with. Spinoza saw this substance as equivalent to and proof for the existence of God. Furthermore, Spinoza makes the claim that because all things are ultimately derived from one substance, in other words, one God, it follows that all events would be determined by necessity, which is to say that everything that has and will happen is part of a long chain of cause and effect derived from God, which is essentially unalterable. The ethical implications of these ideas are complex and numerous, so a full discussion of them is beyond the scope of this message, which I'm sure you're all very glad for. But I would like to share with you a thought experiment meant to serve as a sort of primer for Spinozist ethics, which is entitled The Curious Case of the Rude Driver in the SUV. This thought experiment was originally presented to me by Dr. Brent Adkins, a philosophy professor at Roanoke College, and the best teacher at any level from whom I've had the good fortune of learning. It goes a little something like this. Imagine you are driving on a freeway at a steady pace. This isn't Texas, and you're a reasonable sort of person, so let's just say you're driving a normal car like a coupe or a hatchback. Suddenly, you see an enormous SUV quickly approaching the lane to your left. This is no small SUV. This is something way over the top. We're talking Escalade, Suburban, really just enormous vehicle, obnoxiously enormous vehicle. It's rapidly gaining ground on you, seemingly unaware of you or your modest vehicle. You notice an exit is coming up and you think to yourself, this guy better not be doing what I think he's doing, but it's too late. The SUV's course has been set and giving you almost no time to react. The almost comically oversized vehicle suddenly cuts you off to make the exit, forcing you to quickly hit the brakes to avoid an accident that would surely end much worse for you than it would have ended for the SUV. If you're like most people, you are now angry. Someone in a vehicle so large that it probably shouldn't even be allowed on the road just forced their way in front of you, nearly causing an accident in your mind, just to make an exit that could have been made easily and safely had they just moved to the right lane 1,000 feet ago. It's infuriating. But now let's imagine that the story continues. As you pass the exit, cursing the wretched SUV under your breath, it dawns on you that was a hospital exit. From the freeway, you can still see the SUV as it pulls toward the ER, and just before it's no longer in view, you catch a glimpse of the driver as he gets out to rush around to the passenger side and assist a woman exiting the vehicle who is very clearly very pregnant. Your heart sinks. While you may feel remorseful or perhaps even guilty for cursing the SUV earlier, there is one feeling that is now conspicuously absent: anger. Yet what has changed? You were still cut off by a ridiculously large vehicle. That fact hasn't changed. No, what has changed in the second half of the story is that the reason why the SUV driver was rushing has been revealed. You can see why you were cut off now. And because of this, it no longer seems as if the SUV driver had a choice. The situation couldn't have played out any other way. It was an emergency, after all. This is the first ethical insight we gain from Spinoza. To the extent that you understand, you cannot be angry. Of course, anyone who spent a substantial amount of time on the freeway knows that rarely, if ever, is the reason for being cut off by someone gunning for the exit revealed to us. As it is in life generally, we don't typically understand what motivates people to do wrong by us. And this often makes forgiveness a difficult challenge. Imagine a more realistic version of the SUV story. You're cut off by someone who happens to be heading to the hospital in an emergency, but you never see this yourself, so you continue to be angry anyway. And that would be the end of that, but it doesn't need to be. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. This rather famous line is the 5th verse of the 3rd chapter of the book of Proverbs. Although I've known this line for a long time, it wasn't until my experience in philosophy that I could see how to interpret it properly. Human understanding is by its very nature limited and imperfect. No matter how much you learn or how much you know, there will always be vastly more that you haven't learned and that you don't know. When you lean on your own imperfect understanding, the result is often imperfect, and this is particularly salient in matters of ethics and judgment. As we saw in the more realistic version of our SUV narrative, leaning on our own understanding led to unjustified anger born from limited knowledge. Our alternative is to put our trust in God, to believe, as Spinoza attempted to prove, that everything ultimately flows from God in an unchangeable chain, and to lean on our faith when our understanding fails us. This brings us to the 3rd and final version of the SUV story. I promise there won't be more. Again, imagine you find yourself cut off, and again, imagine you don't know why. This time, though, you don't need to know why. This time you make the choice not to lean on your own understanding. This time you put your trust in the necessity of all things through God. Perhaps the driver of the SUV was rushing because of some medical emergency, as was the case in the original story. Perhaps there was some other emergency. Perhaps there was no emergency at all, or at least not one that you could understand. It does not matter, for although the reason is not clear to you, the situation is no less certain. There was something that caused you to be cut off, and that cause, like all causes, ultimately came from God. The conclusion of this version of the story is no different than the conclusion from the first. The situation couldn't have played out any other way. Knowing this, your anger will fade. You can forgive the driver. Recall our Old Testament lesson today. Everything God does will endure forever. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. Whatever is has already been, and what will be has been before, and God will call the past to account. This is an affirmation of the ubiquitous and unalterable nature of God's will. It is a statement that is echoed within the deterministic conclusions of Spinoza and countless other great thinkers throughout history. Yet, it is not a conclusion reached without considerable difficulty. The very next verse of this lesson concerns the existence of wickedness in places of judgment and justice, a fact that is often difficult. A fact that is often difficult for us to reconcile with the omnipresence of God. After all, if God is everywhere all the time, why does wickedness persist? This is a classic question, the problem of evil. It is quite easy to accept the omnipresence of God when it appears to lead to beauty or love, but it becomes difficult indeed when we experience pain and suffering and wickedness. The narrator of the lesson responds to this problem in two ways. First, he suggests that although things may seem unjust or unfair in life, God will eventually bring into judgment both the wicked and the righteous when the time is right. After all, he works on his time, not ours. There will be a time for every activity, a time to judge every deed. The narrator then reminds us to be humble in our understanding. For we humans are more similar to the animals than we are different. Ultimately, our fates are the same. All come from dust, and to dust all return. This may very well be the only fact that can ever truly be known, and we must always remember this, lest we fall into the trap of leaning too heavily on our own understanding. As we discussed earlier, forgiveness is often made difficult when we lean on our own understanding, but the judgment of others is also made far easier. The more we think we know about what ought to be, the more comfortable we become with imposing our own will on others without regard for the will of God. It is a pitfall against which Jesus continuously warned, and his message about this is perhaps best exemplified in the gospel lesson we heard today. We all know this lesson. Most English speakers, both Christian and non-Christian alike, are familiar with the phrase, "cast the first stone." Often it is construed primarily as a lesson against hypocrisy, a parable to show that it is wrong to judge the sins of others when you yourself have sinned. This is a fine lesson, but I believe it misses the larger point being made. After Jesus avoids the trap set by the Pharisees, skillfully affirming the law of Moses while making it impossible for anyone in the crowd to take part in the sentencing, he does something even more impressive. He doesn't condemn the woman taken in adultery either. Jesus Christ, the ultimate sinless figure, is perhaps the only person in the history of the world who might have been justified in casting the first stone. But he does not. Why? I believe the answer is that Jesus forgave the woman to show us that our own virtue should take precedence over the sins of another. And I believe that this is the true lesson here. Virtue is more important than sin. Forgiveness is more important than blame. Of course, the Gospel of John is not the only place where Jesus is quoted speaking against the judgment of others. This was a rather favorite theme of his. He warns about it also in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, employing one of his most famous metaphors, that of the mote and the beam. In later translations, this is referred to as the speck of sawdust and the plank. That's the translation I'll be using. Like the lesson we read from the Gospel of John today, the example of the speck and the plank is often regarded primarily as a lesson against hypocrisy. But I believe that, again, this misses the point. Do not judge, or you too will be judged, says Jesus at the beginning of the 7th chapter of Matthew's Gospel during the Sermon on the Mount. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First, take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. This example seems a little strange to us. It makes more sense in the context if you remember Jesus being a carpenter. He would use a wood example. But basically what he's saying is, why would you judge somebody for having a small flaw in their eye when you have so many flaws right in front of your face, so many things that you as a person have wrong? Considering the lesson that we heard earlier today with the woman taken in adultery, I believe it's fairly clear that Jesus is speaking ironically when he says, first take the plank out of your own eye. His point is that you will never be in a position to judge the individual flaws of your brother. You will never see them with total clarity, because your vision is continuously clouded by flaws and prejudices that you yourself, as a human, certainly possess. Why else would Jesus choose to use such an extreme metaphor? Removing the plank from your own eye would be equivalent to achieving a sort of God's eye view, an impossible task. What Jesus wants from us is to simply recognize the limitations of our knowledge and reserve judgment with this in mind. He teaches us to forgive our brothers and sisters for their flaws because we are in no position to judge them. At this point, it is important to point out that forgiveness does not imply acceptance or approval. Indeed, forgiveness can only take place in the absence of acceptance. You can only forgive someone after he or she has already done something you perceive as wrong. By the same token, refraining from judgment does not mean that you cannot offer constructive criticism to those who have sinned. Helping our family and friends to improve is a Christian virtue. It is only when such criticism becomes vindictive that it is problematic. For those that are vindictive think so highly of their judgment that they might cast it as if they were gods. And this is incompatible with the teachings of Christ. No matter how sure you feel in your righteousness, remember that it is God's duty to judge and not yours. The Pharisees were absolutely correct in their interpretation of the law of Moses. The adulterous woman had indeed sinned. Where they erred was in assuming that it was therefore their place to cast judgment. Jesus teaches us that it was not their place, and it is not ours. So as you make your way down the freeway of life, remember that you will invariably be cut off from time to time, and sometimes by ridiculously sized vehicles. Forgive those who trespass against you. At times this will seem very difficult, but in the words of Spinoza and the conclusion of his Ethics, needs must it be hard, since it is so seldom found. How would it be possible, if salvation were ready to our hand and could without great labor be found, that it should be by almost all men neglected? But all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. Thankfully, we have the example set by Jesus Christ, a man who was betrayed and forgave his betrayers, a man who was tortured and forgave his torturers, a man who was finally murdered and in resurrection forgave his murderers, to inspire us. While we should hope to never face such trials ourselves, let us use Christ's example to grant us perspective. Let us be humble in our understanding, and let us strive to do as he taught in the Sermon on the Plain: judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Thank you.
Thank you.